Hi, welcome to the first episode of I'm on a CIA watch list with Cameron Langley. Previously, I did a show in January of 2019 called The Post-Millennial with Cameron Langley. Unfortunately, somebody has since got that channel name and has more subscribers, and I don't want to be confused with anybody else. I went through many different channel names. They were all clever, and some of my friends went through them, and we decided that I'm on a CIA watch list was probably the cleverest and funniest of them. So without further ado, we talk about the first episode, what we're going to be talking about in this. By the way, right now it's actually November 30th, but it's going into December 1st. So while we're at the end of 2020, I feel like we can recap on that year. So the topics for this episode are going to be the elephant in the room, coronavirus. Another elephant in the room, protests, BLM, fascists, and reflections on activism. And then overlooked story, military interventions in foreign policy, and other notable events. And I'll have an outro at the end. But it's all a 2020 year in review. So, before I start, I want to just touch briefly on what I talked about in that last post-millennial episode in 2019. I discussed some gun control stats, which my views have actually changed on that. I'm not as anti-gun as I was. I saw a leftist viewpoint to guns, and I want to defend the vulnerable. In my eyes, arm the poor, arm the vulnerable, because fascists are a real problem, and some people in this world are just too filled with hate, and they see violence as a solution, and they would seek to kill some of the marginalized community members. So I think that that's a leftist viewpoint on why guns may be necessary. Besides that, I talked about in that show the police stats for 2018, the police brutality stats. Super relevant in this year, and we'll talk about that later. And then I talked about the wars that were going on around then, the pushes for interventions that the CIA was doing in the Trump administration. That'll be another thing we continue to touch on in 2020, and even going into 2021, because neoliberal Biden isn't going to change anything. I can't remember what else I talked about, but other than the gun control thing, mostly stuff that I still agree on and stuff that's very relevant to this day. But anyway, I did tell you the topics in this show, just a 2020 year in review. So now some of this that I tell you, I quote because I wrote down ahead of time. Some of it is directly quoted from the articles, and I'll let you know when there's an article that goes with this. So to start out with, the elephant in the room, coronavirus. First, I want to advise my viewers, abide by the CDC guidelines. Please promote the general welfare of your fellow Americans. Wear your mask, socially distance, try and stay home. This is a crisis, and we can make it all better if we all pitch in our efforts and try to not spread deadly pathogens. I mean, they do exist. My mom works in a hospital. She sees these kinds of things. So it is real, and it needs to be taken seriously. Now, I will agree that there are concerns about what happens during coronavirus and what the government does, just like during any crisis. So, as an example, Congress passed the CARES Act. one of the largest upward transfers of wealth in history. Gave trillions to wealthy Americans, banks, the top 1%, and gave only a couple, I don't even know if it was a couple billion to us. I don't remember the stats. It was not trillions. It was not proportional in any means. And of course, national defense spending has continued too this year. So the fact that the rich get richer even while we all, get poorer and now die, that's a problem. And the government did it under or behind our backs, all of them in Congress, even the progressive ones. That's why you can't trust the Democratic Party, not even the progressive people in there like AOC and the Squad, because they still vote for this stuff, and then they'll come out later and do some theater and say, oh my God, the Republicans are bad for it. And it's like, you helped us get this too. So anyway, so there's an example of things that the government does that's actually tyrannical. Now, conservatives will go, face masks are tyrannical. That's something that the government does during crises that isn't, right. And it's like, yeah, but that's facial coverings. I'd like to remind folks that after 9/11, we actually instituted a lot of policies and institutions and whatnot that actually targeted Americans and were actually tyrannical. And one of those is the facial recognition and some of the NSA spying that people like Edward Snowden have told us about, that is, facial coverings is antithetical to facial recognition. So I'll take facial coverings over facial recognition. It's actually giving us a bit of a benefit right now. The only other conservative argument I see is, well, when you wear a face mask, they can't see your pretty face, and it's, that's just a justification that is not a justification. So, but I'd like to state my position that if Americans would be following these guidelines, wearing the mask and trying to work with us through the lockdown, we would not have this new lockdown happening. As unfortunate as it is, it stresses small businesses, I understand. But we got to all get through it together. Not one of us can just, put everybody else in danger just to get ours, especially when some people are losing their everything. So now I want to give you some stats, United States stats, Oregon stats, and Coos County stats. Obviously that, tells you where I'm at. I'm in Coos County, Oregon. But I feel like it's, relevant on all scales, because any deaths are too many deaths. Any confirmed cases are too many confirmed cases. And it's important to know the numbers. These stats were from Bing search. I know some of you are going, ew, Bing. I am too. It was just the default search engine. I hadn't changed it when I looked it up. These were the stats that it brought up, because they had the coronavirus little tracker thing. As of November 29th, when I checked, the United States had 13,506,766 confirmed cases, 270,520 deaths, 6,543,563 recovered, which it's good, but there's still hundreds of thousands of deaths. Note that we are currently in one of our largest spikes yet, going into November. So please take the right precautions and don't be irresponsible. And I'd also like to note that there are 4 million confirmed cases than the next country, which is India. So, and 4 million people is the population of Oregon. So it's a bigger number than you'd think. Now we'll go into Oregon stats. Oregon had 74,120 confirmed cases, 905 deaths, and there was no data for how many recovered. We're also witnessing a spike in Oregon. There's always a anti-Governor Brown mentality. I'm no fan of her here. I don't think she's a good governor. I protest her from the left. But, I am not the kind of Governor Whitmer kidnapper type people that gets crazy about, oh, Governor Brown's so bad. She's the governor. That's, she's with the establishment. Obviously, they're going to make decisions that help the status quo. So try and follow the guidelines in Oregon, and then in Coos County, where I'm at, 425 confirmed cases. We've only had 3 deaths, but 3 is too much. 1 was too many. I remember when we had the first, it was a shock, but not shocking at the same time, and there was no data given for recovered. No data for if there was a spike or not, but I imagine there would be. Now I want to talk about BIPOC being hit harder by coronavirus. So this is from an article from The Hill about them getting hit harder. And it says, communities of color have been hit the hardest by economic and social challenges spurred by the coronavirus pandemic. According to a new study, adding to the well-documented toll the pandemic has had on health within these communities, the new study conducted by NPR, Harvard, and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation found that 72% of Latino households, 60% of Black households, and 55% of Native American households reported serious financial problems. Those problems included struggling to pay credit card bills, rent, utilities, and being able to afford food. Notably, across the board, the most common problem was little to no savings. Roughly 4 in 10 Black, Latino, and Native American households said that most, if not all, their savings would have been used during the pandemic. So you can see how it's hitting these more vulnerable communities harder. Obviously, a reason why anybody who is left of center should not be denying the severity of this crisis. Perfectly fine to be wary of the government, corporations, and internet fascists and whatnot, but I would not be, skeptical of the virus itself, because this is a problem that leftism could help. Also, you can see how systemic racism is making it worse for these communities. And then a next stat from this is the unemployment crisis. This is from crsreports.congress.gov. The unemployment rate peaked at an unprecedented level not seen since data collection started in 1948 in April 2020, before declining to a still elevated level in October. In April, every state and the District of Columbia reached unemployment rates greater than their highest unemployment rates during the Great Recession. So you can see how many people are losing their jobs. And then you've got what I want to talk about next, the evictions. Cruel landlords continue evictions during COVID. This is from Statista. Up to 40 million Americans face eviction due to coronavirus. 29 to 40% of renters face eviction, while the CDC still suggests halting evictions during the pandemic. And then some of you might be going, oh, well, this is all sad, but your protests didn't help. There was no connection between protests and COVID this year. No large connection, at least. There was some, and it was admitted, but BLM protests, by and large, had people wearing masks, distancing when possible. Conservative anti-lockdown protests, Back the Blue rallies, and counter-protests of BLM rallies were much more dangerous, considering very little participants followed any CDC guidelines. Plus, BLM people were protesting continued murder, beatings, and oppression by police, literally standing up for black lives. Conservatives were protesting COVID mandates because it inconvenienced them and because the president was denying the virus or telling people to use hydrochloroquine or using the deadly idea of herd immunity. And the Back the Blue events were just an ignorant response to BLM. Only other conservative protests were for QAnon, which is a fascist cult started on the internet that believes most Democrats and celebrities are involved in a child trafficking ring, and that adrenochrome was a thing, and that Republicans and religious figures were absolutely not involved. So ask yourself, what did people risk it for when they protest, and how did they protest? Did they follow the guidelines? So that's not word for word. That's actually, when I wrote that, that's my interpretation, but it was on that point of view about the protests and coronavirus. But I did source the No Large Connection from the National Review, and I'll post that article. The article actually says protests may have spread coronavirus, some cities admit, but not in any significant way. And once again, before I end this section, I want to advise folks to follow CDC guidelines, keeping an eye on, governments and corporations and bad players on, different sides of the, not different sides, different elements of fringe political spectrums, not talking about on the left, basically right-wing fascists. But that's still essential, keeping an eye on them. And I want to thank essential workers, and especially hospital workers during this pandemic. They've done jobs that many of us can't imagine because we've never had to deal with a crisis hands-on like that. So the next one is another elephant in the room. Protests, BLM, fascists, reflections on activism. So first off, you had the anti-lockdown tantrums. Large-scale protests really began in April-May, predominantly conservative in reaction to the COVID lockdowns, mask mandates. They took to the streets in many places in the U.S., including Richmond, Detroit, Salem, taking many reckless actions, including Operation Gridlock, which at the Sparrow Hospital in Michigan blocked the entrance to a hospital and at one point ended up preventing an ambulance from reaching the hospital, in which case it had to go down a one-way street to get to the hospital. And I actually got a link to that story with the Independent news. And of course, I've seen BLM rallies where they said, open up the street, there's an ambulance coming through, they let it right through. They let emergency vehicles through as long as they're not police, understandably. And then the big story of the year, big story of protesting. Black Lives Matter. So after the killings of Ahmaud Arbery by Georgia white supremacists in February, and Breonna Taylor by Louisville police in March, George Floyd was killed broad daylight by a Minneapolis police officer who kneeled on his neck until a while after Floyd couldn't handle it anymore and died. On top of decades and decades of these senseless racist killings happening prior to this and the world seemingly descending into chaos anyway, the last straw was pulled and Black Americans and allies hit the streets hard in June and for the rest of the summer. As expected, riots erupted in many cities across the U.S. Other events like marches, rallies, vigils, etc. would follow. Right-wing elements, energized by anti-lockdown protests, reacted to this with Back the Blue rallies, All Lives Matter, and in some cases with actual hate groups in the streets such as Proud Boys, Patriot Prayer, neo-Nazis, and many right-wing patriot militias. Many clashes with these groups occurred in places around the country. Very often in Portland, Oregon, where National Guards and feds ended up being sent in, which then resulted in a larger problem. Militarized police countered protests from day one, but when the feds were called in, people in Portland were being abducted off the streets by them. Many people were injured heavily from rubber bullets, tear gas canisters, flashbangs, LRADs, and police weaponry such as batons and shields. Good accomplishments did come from some of the protesting, though, as Minneapolis decided to defund and dismantle its police department. Unfortunately, neither George Floyd neither Breonna Taylor received justice, and more black people were senselessly killed by the police, including Sean Reed, David McCaddy, and more. Many people have become activists for racial justice because of this, though, and the battle is far from over. I myself was involved in multiple BLM anti-racist events this summer in Coos Bay and once in Eugene, and I did 4 in June, 2 in July, and 1 in August, as well as a group called Safer as One that rose from those events to elevate voices of the sub-communities of the community of Coos Bay, such as BIPOC, LGBTQ+, disabled, houseless, etc. Safer as One did daily demonstrations from mid-July until at least September, when political tensions were rising and wildfire smoke was choking out all of Western Oregon. As of now, we've been weathering out COVID with the recent surge and hoping political tensions subside a little bit as election season is over, while reflecting on what our goals are going forward. I've just figured I'd give you my local perspective. I was involved in a lot of local stuff for Black Lives. I felt like I'd give you a quick summary. And then I included reactionary movements, and I don't want to go into this that much, but right-wingers continued with Back the Blue events, COVID protests, and QAnon rallies throughout the year, and it was clear that fascists were becoming a problem in the streets of America. And at some point one day I'll post a video explaining why I so brazenly call them fascists. Multiple black and trans people were lynched in different places in the U.S., ruled a suicide in at least one case. In Portland, at some point, a Trump supporter ended up getting killed in the midst of chaos there. And in Kenosha, a kid named Kyle Rittenhouse shot and killed an anti-fascist protester who was attempting to hit him with a skateboard. Rittenhouse brought his weapon from another state, though, and was too young to be in possession of the weapon anyway. He was arrested, but later bailed out by a conservative celebrity. There have been many instances this year of threats by conservatives towards BIPOC and allies, and outright assaults and murders, including driving over protesters, trapping and harassing BIPOC on vacation, trying to run cars off the road, shooting protesters with bows or guns, and even a planned attempt to kidnap the Michigan governor for her COVID laws. In comparison, BIPOC and allies have threatened and hurt few. Most cases of violence from them comes from Portland, and any fascists would not have been out there, though, if the fascists were not taking to the streets, countering BLM events, etc. And riots would not have been occurring if police brutality wasn't still occurring, or there was any way to bring change without hitting pocketbooks. Though despite conservative claims that Antifa destroyed American cities, even Portland's battlescape was confined to a few blocks, not the whole city. Most riots occurred directly after George Floyd's death, and this is something everybody should have expected naturally, because it's happened throughout history. Go back and look. Jim Crow, after slavery, civil rights movement in the 60s, the 90s, the early 2000s, 2014, and now. So it's not surprising. Other protests. Other than COVID protests and BLM protests and counter-protests, there was not much other large protests or events happening. Trump supporters protested the result of the election. Biden supporters danced in the streets. Some folks did fuck Trump and fuck Biden rallies. Online activism continued for many movements, but did not hit as hard as the ones on the streets. There was also some anti-war protests in early 2020, and amid the Trump administration's push for war with Iran, as well as protests against the Democratic establishment's actions in the primary. And then want to bring up strike potential is rising. There were general strikes and calls for general strikes, as well as protests against evictions and lack of rent cancellations, but these received little media attention. Now, this is something I foresee becoming a bigger story in 2020 as we possibly end up seeing the collapse of the economy. So, And then my reflections on activism. Capitalism and COVID strangle activism hard, and infighting in these movements destroys them more effectively than any outside force. So activists need to learn to support and listen to one another and be inclusive and open-minded, and to act from a place of leadership, not emotional reactivity. We also need to all set up sufficient support networks while still following our sufficient support networks in our communities and be more cognizant of everybody's capabilities while still following Rule 303. If you have the means, you have the responsibility. Also, please research counterintelligence, or they will bring you down from the inside. So let's talk about they. Who's they? CIA. That's why I did this show. The show is a joke about I'm leftist enough that, you know, you think about McCarthyism in the 60s and the 50s, even late 40s, where they, I guess you'd call it the Red Scare in the late 40s, but where they ratted out communists in all society, blacklisted them, you know, even hunted them down, threatened them, killed them in some cases. That's the CIA, and they're not a good thing. They spy on all of us, and they're probably more of a problem than any of the people we point fingers at in society today. So, talking more larger than just the CIA, though, let's talk about military interventions, because this is an overlooked story of 2020. So, war with Iran looms. So, in December 31st, we had our embassy attacked. The Iraqis, they're in a revolution. It was expected anyway. We've been there for longer than we were ever in Vietnam. So we surged troops in Iraq and did a military strike at some point that killed Iranian top general Qasem Soleimani, an assassination that Trump and his supporters were happy to brag about, despite the fact that it was a flagrant war crime that almost escalated into a full-blown war as the Trump administration put all options on the table when it came to Iran. War didn't happen, the spies were caught in Iran, multiple drone conundrums occurred in the Strait of Hormuz, a Saudi oil refinery was attacked, and Saudi Arabia and Israel were ready for that war to come. After this, the Trump administration let some advisors go because they weren't tough enough, and then by election time recently, he had to be talked out of bombing Iran on at least one occasion by his own advisors. And escalations with Iran are still hot. With the CIA as the heater, like always. Just the other day, a nuclear scientist who was working on their program was assassinated in Iran, probably by a CIA agent. Mind you, they still face sanctions from us. We occupy both countries on the sides of them and have for some time. We have our naval fleets near them almost always. We fly drones over their airspace. And their northwestern neighbor, Azerbaijan, has been at conflict with Armenia this year. Anti-war activism needs to come back soon. My next thing, Monroe Doctrine still alive. I think I can kind of, since this is coming up on the limit that I have on my phone for how long this video can go, I can kind of rush over some of this. We've still been trying to push intervention in Latin American countries like Venezuela and Cuba. Bolivia saw American-backed right-wing coup earlier following a DEA sting there. They came back with a vengeance in their election, electing a supporter of Morales, the person who was ousted in the coup, to be president again, effectively defeating that coup for now. Big reason for the coup in the first place was because Bolivia had the lithium that Elon Musk eyed for his Teslas, as shown in his cryptic tweets about it, and his stocks when the coup happened, and when it failed. Mexico also discovered it had a large lithium deposit, and some hawks like Pete Buttigieg even suggested military intervention there because of the drug war, which we started via the CIA and the DEA. Too many letters. It's definitely a theater to keep an eye on, and shows that the Monroe Doctrine is still alive, where we say Latin America is our backyard, and then we Russia's a big problem. They're expanding in Europe. We can't have that. China, they want their South China Sea. That's expansion, man. They're an empire. You gotta stop them. But we can have bases all around the world. We just want to say, hey, this soil right here, and Uganda, this is American soil now. This is an American military base. No, please don't step foot on this military base. We'll shoot you. That's America. We're an empire. Cold War continued. Don't need to go into that. Everybody knows neoconservatives fearmonger about China. Neoliberals fearmonger about Russia. They both still support Iran and Venezuela. They still peddle the Russiagate bullshit. It's been debunked by people like Greenwald and Aaron Mate. Go look it up. Money for war but can't feed the poor. Defense spending continued even during COVID. We got money for imperialist slaughter of non-Americans and some Americans because cops love military tech and the military-industrial complex loves their money, but not for people when we're literally in the worst economic crisis since at least '08. And a war old enough to go to war. Afghanistan is going on after 19 years. I wrote a lot of other stuff down, but basically all the interventions that we've been in for the, years we're still in. Trump didn't end them. He pandered to the anti-war people, and he wasn't as bad as Obama, but he's still a war criminal, still a hawk. Other notable events. Skip a couple of these since they're not so important. Red skies. Climate change is not halted for coronavirus. The hurricane season was relatively calm, but wildfires hit western states very hard. I personally witnessed orange skies in Oregon, and the wildfire smoke was choking us out. It was very bad for respiratory health. 2020 was also set to be the hottest year since 2016, but I don't know if those stats came true. I'll have to look that up and tell you in one of the future videos. But Trump and Biden have refused to support a Green New Deal, and it probably won't pass the Republican-held Senate. And neoliberalism is back. I can shorten this by saying Buttigieg dropped out of the primary because Obama told him to, and he already did the Shadow app, which was creepy before. They stole it from Bernie. Bernie was a capitulator to the establishment. He could have stood up more before Super Tuesday against Biden, but he didn't. It was his friend. So he dropped out, supported Biden. We got, because of coronavirus and the protests, we ended up getting Biden elected, and we get neoliberalism back. And they're not going to do progressive stuff. You're not going to push Biden left. Anyway, thank you for watching the show. Like, share, subscribe, give me feedback. I apologize for any problems in quality. I'm coming up on my last couple seconds here. Thank you for tuning in. Keep it up. This has been today's episode of I'm on a CIA watch list with Cameron Langley. See you next show.